Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. The United States has said it was preparing to send a missile defence system to Guam to defend it from North Korea in the coming weeks. The US Defence Secretary Chuck Hagel said North Korea presented a real and clear danger, making threats that he has to take seriously. Meanwhile, this afternoon, South Korea's foreign minister said North Korea has shifted a missile with considerable range to its east coast. Kim Kwan-jin played down concerns that the missile could target the US mainland, but said the North's intentions were not yet clear. It all comes in a week when Pyongyang has ramped up its rhetoric. For the second day running, it's denied entry from the south into the Kaesong Industrial Zone. That zone is the only example of cross-border cooperation and earns crucial hard currency for the impoverished north. But it does require the expertise of South Korean managers. It also said that it would reopen the mothballed Yongbyon nuclear power plant. So is this the usual bluster from North Korea, or is there something more to it? Well, to discuss this, joining me in the studio in London here is Jim Hoare. He was the former chargé d'affaires of the British Embassy in Pyongyang from 2001 to 2002. We'll also be joined by our guest in Moscow, the political commentator for Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich. But Jim, thank you very much for joining us here. You wrote in the Guardian newspaper yesterday that these latest moves are unlikely to signal a world war or anything like that. But do you think that there's anything new? Is there an edge to what is coming out of Pyongyang that we haven't seen in the past?
It's very difficult to tell. The annual US-South Korean exercises, military exercises, which are going on at the moment, have always produced a strong reaction from the North Koreans. They go on to a state of semi-military alert, whatever that means as distinct from military alert, I'm not sure, but that's the sort of term they've used in the past. They have practice air raid drills. Everybody is exhorted to be careful and to watch. So that is part of the annual reaction, as it were. You've also got this year the continuing expressions of dissatisfaction about UN sanctions arising from both the nuclear test and the rocket test last year. So to a certain extent, it's the usual response, but a bit more edge this year, perhaps because of these other events. But I still don't see in it the move towards a conflict. They keep saying, we are ready for war and we could go to war, but they're not actually doing very much about preparing for war. My understanding is that Pyongyang is pretty quiet. Most of the soldiers on the streets are in fact engaged in construction work, and there isn't a sort of sense of imminent danger in Pyongyang. I saw on the BBC this morning a journalist had been to Panmunjom and complained that there was no sense of tension there, that the North Koreans didn't even mention the fact that they were in a semi-war state. So it isn't quite as serious, I think, as some commentators are saying.
But do you think that the words that are coming from Pyongyang are justified in a way? I mean, we have US dispatches, B-2 stealth bombers from the US over South Korean territory. I mean, even Clinton didn't do that in the 90s. I mean, do they feel that there's a genuine grievance, and perhaps maybe there is a genuine grievance here?
I think they certainly feel that they are being pushed by the United States, that the United States is threatening. These exercises are very big. I've seen the predecessor, Team Spirit, actually on the ground a long time ago now. But large numbers of men are involved, large amounts of equipment, stuff is brought in from the mainland United States. It does look threatening. And of course, you could always argue, as the North Koreans do, that this would provide perfect cover for an attack. So that's the usual thing. This year you've got these extra edges to it from the United States, which in a sense is reacting to what the North Koreans have been saying, rather than doing. And that, of course, ratchets up the tension as well. So I think on both sides we have a little bit of theatrical games going on. It's dangerous because of the tension in the area normally. It's dangerous because of the large number of armed forces there are on both sides of the demilitarized zone. It doesn't need to go any further, but there's always the possibility that somebody misunderstands orders, or some incident such as animals in the demilitarized zone, which are always setting off tripwires and guns and so on, can lead to something else because everybody's at a heightened state of tension.
But doesn't that get to the heart of what I suppose concerns not just the regional community in Southeast Asia, but also the wider global community, in that we could have as you say, perhaps some kind of conflagration started almost by accident. The rhetoric is just a sideline to it, and in a state of heightened tension, especially if North Korea are making these kinds of threats, whether they mean it or not, we could have something that starts by accident, and that could spiral into quite considerable violence.
Well, we could have some sort of incident. I mean, there have been enough in the past. But if you look at the record, both sides across the demilitarized zone have always had a sense of just how far to push things. I first went to South Korea in 1976, in the autumn of 1976, 3 weeks after 2 American officers had been hacked to death in a skirmish at Panmunjom. I've never seen so much military equipment on the ground. Between Seoul and Panmunjom, every riverbed was full of American tanks, South Korean tanks, soldiers, everything else. But each side knew when to draw back. I wasn't there, obviously, in 1968, but when the Pueblo, the US spy ship, was captured by the North Koreans, at one point the Americans had high states of alert, cancelled all surveillance flights throughout the world. But after a bit, each side sort of knew how far to go. It's always difficult because things move on and new people are in place, but I suspect that each side will do a lot of pushing, but each side just knows that at some point you have to pull back a bit.
But certainly in South Korea, for instance, the South Korean media seem to report regularly the North's apocalyptic threats, but the public seems to have heard it all before, and it has little effect certainly on the South Korean population, doesn't it? I mean, in fact, markets seem to have stayed steady. No one's pulling investments out of South Korea. I mean, and it sounds like in North Korea, from what you've heard on the ground, the situation seems to be relatively normal.
As far as I can tell, I mean, I'm obviously not in either place, and so can't be sure. But in South Korea, when I lived in South Korea in the early 1980s, we had instructions in the embassy to be prepared for an attack, that we were supposed to keep water in the bath and a suitcase packed. I mean, not many of us did it, but those were the sort of instructions. I don't think anybody does that now. So everybody has got a little more relaxed as the years have gone by. Maybe that's a false sense of security, but I suspect it's also that from the 1990s onwards, the South Koreans got to know a lot more about North Korea than they had before, and they've realised that it is not actually the major power that they once thought it was. It's still got a large army, it's got a lot of military equipment, but the army has suffered hunger like the rest of the country. The military equipment is old and often quite decrepit. I saw more military lorries broken down in North Korea than I've seen anywhere else in the world. So this is not a state-of-the-art army, and it's facing 2 state-of-the-art armies across the demilitarized zone. South Korea is a very modern military force, well-equipped. The United States is, of course, the world's premier military force. So you've got a pretty run-down Third World army with often Second World War vintage equipment, or just after the Second World War vintage equipment, facing these 2 high-tech modern armies.
Well, I'll turn to our political commentator in Moscow, Dmitry Babich. We heard the words today, Dmitry, from the Russian Foreign Ministry that Russia has said Pyongyang's actions are, quote, unacceptable. I mean, what's Russia's take on this? Clearly, the last time that there were 6-party talks was about 5 years ago, and Russia was a part of that. Obviously, North Korea also borders Russia, so Russia sees itself as part of some kind of solution, doesn't it?
Well, there is no question that Russia sees itself as a part of solution, not as a part of a problem. And even today, there was a comment that came from the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Alexander Lukashevich. He said, I quote, that North Korea's decision to legally claim nuclear status may block prospects for 6-party talks. I mean, Moscow, just like Beijing, just like many other countries, is sort of losing patience with North Korea. And if there is a country that is interested in a peaceful solution to this crisis, maybe after South Korea, that is Russia. And this is probably the reason why South Korea was often more reliant on Russia than on some European powers during its contacts with North Korea, especially in that period of relative detente in the end of 90s, and in the time when South Korea was ruled by that pacifist president, the author of the policy, or that sunshine policy towards North Korea. So I would not say that Russia is in any way trying to gain cheap political capital from that situation. We're concerned, like everyone else, because we have a common border with North Korea, and any kind of conflict would have disastrous consequences also for Russian Far East, not only for South Korea or China.
But is there not a degree of sympathy, perhaps, Dmitry, that North Korea feel a kind of violation, I suppose, and there's certainly no sense, certainly Russia's position on countries involved in the Arab Spring, of any kind of intervention, and they would certainly not countenance any kind of intervention. Moscow wouldn't want the US to ramp up tension. It would be certainly, wouldn't it be sending kind of signals to Washington to stop these military exercises in South Korea?
Well, this position is very much reflected in the Russian media, in the public opinion. A lot of newspapers, including some liberal ones, analyzing the situation. They try to explain the actions of the North Korean young leader, and they say that probably after he saw what happened to Colonel Gaddafi, who canceled his nuclear program, or to Saddam Hussein, who cracked up not to have any weapons of mass destruction. And probably the North Korean leader decided not to repeat their mistakes and to sort of heighten the stakes in the very beginning, so that the rest of his rule would look like a pacifist exercise compared to what we're seeing now. So indeed, Russia is against any sort of heightening of tensions here. And if we could return to the blessed days of Kim Dae-jung, when, the first in history, the first summit meeting between the North Korean and the South Korean leaders proved to be possible, that would certainly send a very good signal. But I think that, Kim Jong-un, the new North Korean leader, he's a young man, and obviously he opted for this strategy of heightening tensions in order to sort of gain respect, and probably for inner political purposes. He wants to show the military and probably some conservatives that he is no weakling. He is also a worthy successor to Kim Il-sung and to Kim Jong-il, and that he is not going to be weak on the West.
South Korea has a new leader as well, Jim, and it sounds like this kind of brinksmanship, in a sense, happens every time there is a new leader in South Korea. I mean, is that the case over the last 20 years? There are these noises coming from the north to kind of lay down, not show who's boss, because clearly North Korea isn't. But it's a clear message sent to the south, isn't it?
I think there is a degree of testing that goes on, and the tension this time may be a bit more, as your colleague says, because you've got a new young leader in North Korea, who is perhaps determined to show that he's nobody's puppet and he's doing things. But the problem is, of course, we know so little about how the inner workings of the North Korean government and party operate. It's still very much a closed book, although much more information comes out of North Korea now than in the past. But I would think there is an element of testing the new leader in South Korea, coming together with all these other things, the sanctions, the rhetoric on the other side, the continual telling the North Koreans that they can't have nuclear weapons even if they've got them.
But isn't it the case that in the past the threats have actually come from, say, the North Korean foreign ministry or whatever, but today or this week or the last couple of weeks it's come from the supreme leader? Is that significant?
Well, I think that may well reflect the different approach of the new North Korean head. He's not like his father, who was rather withdrawn and certainly didn't come out as the normal head of state. The new leader, Kim Jong-un, does seem to be behaving more like a head of state, even if you don't like what he's doing. But he's making public speeches. He's demonstrably the leader. Kim Jong-il kept back a bit and never spoke in public, was never seen speaking at functions, even without his voice being relayed. So there is a difference of style, and that may also be adding to the confusion, because people haven't been used to that sort of style from North Korea since Kim Il-sung was active up till the early 90s.
Dmitry Babich, I'll turn to you in Moscow. How important is China in all of this? Because we've heard some strong words from them in the last day or two. Do you think that they're losing patience, and is there something that they can do? Is there pressure that they can put to bear to make sure that Pyongyang can toe the line, I suppose?
Well, I think that China's patience will be enormous because they stand to lose a lot if the situation gets out of control. And ideologically, I mean, Russia had a long split with North Korea. Few people now remember that, but between 1966 and 1985, there was almost no relation between the Soviet Union and North Korea, because North Korea, in fact, supported the Maoist policy of then Chinese leadership. So China, having been a friend sort of much longer than the former Soviet Union, and certainly been treated with more trust than Russia by the North Korean leaders, China will try to apply diplomatic pressure and probably to cajole the young man to be more responsible in his behavior. But I agree with Jim that actually we see something new coming from the North Korean leader. And, even philosophically speaking, it doesn't fit the black and white picture of the world that dominated the world media in the 90s and in the last 15 years, probably. He is sort of more open than his father, but he is also more aggressive.
Jim, I'd just like to take that to Jim Horan, the Chinese aspect of a solution, and you did make the point in the Guardian newspaper yesterday that China's interests in the peninsula are different from others involved. North Korea acts as a kind of buffer. I mean, is there a way that is China playing a game whereby, on the one hand, yes, they overtly criticize North Korea because they kind of have to, but in another sense, it does actually take the heat off American scrutiny on them. So this situation suits them in a kind of way.
I think the Chinese see North Korea as quite useful in a number of ways. It is the buffer. It keeps the American forces further away from China. It also, in a sense, preoccupies the Americans so that they have less time to devote to thinking about China. There's also, I think, amongst the Chinese a very strong belief that when the Americans talk about North Korea, they really mean China. And the movement of missiles and so on is as much to do with China as it is to do with North Korea. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but certainly I think that is a Chinese perception. There's also, I think, for the Chinese, the great concern that if North Korea collapsed, they would face immense social problems with large numbers of refugees, as Japan and South Korea might do as well. They might also face the problem of, how would one put it, rogue military elements, some of them possibly with nuclear weapons wandering around on the Korean Peninsula and even into Chinese territory. This may be exaggerating things, but it is something to concern the Chinese, that instead of a relatively settled Korean Peninsula with one part of it friendly, they would have a very dangerous situation in the Korean Peninsula.
But do you not think there's a degree of bad faith on the American side as well, because they're using this as a chance to show a kind of strength and force in the region? China's using it as a way, perhaps, as a buffer against scrutiny of what they're doing. This is actually quite convenient for the international powers, isn't it?
I'd hesitate to use the term bad faith. I think there is sometimes a bit of a delusion amongst the United States leaders that their actions are normal and acceptable. Other people's actions are provocative, and from one side's view, an action may be provocative, even if you know that it's really not intended to be so. But I think that the United States leadership, not just politicians, but in Congress and in the press and so on, often engages in quite high-flown rhetoric itself, and that doesn't help in a situation if we really are concerned that this conflict could, or this rhetoric could develop into something much more serious.
Dmitry Babich in Moscow, I'd just like to get your view on the announcement by North Korea that it's conducted successful nuclear tests, and there were tests, I think, in 2006, 2009, again this year. I mean, what do you think of the significance of the third nuclear test? What do you make of that?
Well, I think it is every nuclear test is one too many, but it looks like the North Korean leadership managed to convince the outside world that they do have a nuclear weapon now, and that certainly changed the situation during the last 2 or 3 years. Returning to China, I would like to add that the decision by the Americans to move their anti-ballistic missiles, actually most of them, to Alaska, purportedly to counter a possible North Korean strike, it was certainly viewed with great suspicion by China, because you don't need so many anti-missiles. There are about 24 of them, as far as I can remember. They are not useful against North Korea, but they can be potentially useful against the Chinese missile capability, which is not very big. So I think that indeed North Korea opted for this kind of belligerent stance, probably learning from the experience of Iraq, Libya, and now Syria. They see that this kind of accommodation that, for example, Colonel Gaddafi tried to practice didn't work, so they opted for rather arming themselves instead of disarming themselves.
And on the nuclear test point, Jim Howard, do you think, I mean, they referred to a high-level test. Do you think that this means the use of highly enriched uranium rather than plutonium, or what's your take on that?
I'm no scientist, and I wouldn't really feel qualified to say. I suspect what you have with the North Korean nuclear program is that it has a momentum of its own, as does the missile development, and that the people charged with doing this will continually press for further expansion. This happens in every country with any new scientific program. They'll want more tests, they'll want more resources, and they'll need to produce results to show that this is a sensible way of doing things. And I think you've got an element of that in North Korea. Where it goes, I don't know. I think the idea that the North Koreans will somehow just agree to give up their nuclear program it's far too late for that. That was possible once, but not now. Somehow you've got to come to an accommodation that accepts that they have the know-how and they could develop weapons, but you could, I think, if you paid the right amount, and I suspect it is payment in a sense, whatever the actual details, you could probably cap a program, but you can't get rid of it anymore. And I agree entirely that having seen what happened in the Middle East, having seen what happened to Gaddafi and others, that they are not going to just say, okay, we give up our weapons. I was in Pyongyang on a visit at the time Colonel Gaddafi fell, and there was quite a lot of knowledge around amongst the sort of people we met about what was happening in Libya, although it wasn't actually covered on the television except very, very obliquely.
So the best that we can hope for, the ultimate goal here, isn't a denuclearization of North Korea?
I suspect that is going to be very difficult. But I think in the short term, we should try and get away from the posturing. So you take the weapons out of Guam, you stop overflying South Korean territory with nuclear-capable bombers. The North Koreans come down, which I think they probably will do from their rhetoric heights. There's two things coming up. One is the Kim Il-sung birthday anniversary on the 15th of April. And the other, of course, it will be the end of the military exercises. And those will provide an opportunity to start toning things down.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time. I'd just like to thank my guest here in the studio, Jim Hoare, former chargé d'affaires at the British Embassy in Pyongyang in 2001 and 2002. And on the line in Moscow, our political commentator, Dmitry Babich, likely to signal a world war or anything like that. But do you think that there's anything new? Is there an edge to what is coming out of Pyongyang that we haven't seen in the past?
It's very difficult to tell. The annual US-South Korean exercises, military exercises, which are going on at the moment, have always produced a strong reaction from the North Koreans. They go on to a state of semi-military alert, whatever that means as distinct from military alert, I'm not sure, but that's the sort of term they've used in the past. They have practice air raid drills.
Zone. That zone is the only example of cross-border cooperation and earns crucial hard currency for the impoverished North. But it does require the expertise of South Korean managers. It also said that it would reopen the mothballed Yongbyon nuclear power plant. So is this the usual bluster from North Korea, or is there something more to it? Well, to discuss this, joining me in the studio in London here is Jim Hoare. He was the former chargé d'affaires of the British Embassy in Pyongyang from 2001 to 2002. We'll also be joined by our guest in Moscow, the political commentator for Voice of Russia, Dmitry Babich. But Jim, thank you very much for joining us here. You wrote in the Guardian newspaper yesterday that these latest moves are Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. The United States has said it was preparing to send a missile defense system to Guam to defend it from North Korea in the coming weeks. The US Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said North Korea presented a real and clear danger, making threats that he has to take seriously. Meanwhile, this afternoon, South Korea's foreign minister said North Korea has shifted a missile with considerable range to its east coast. Kim Kwan-jin played down concerns that the missile could target the US mainland, but said the North's intentions were not yet clear. It all comes in a week when Pyongyang has ramped up its rhetoric. For the second day running, it's denied entry from the south into the Kaesong industrial.
Preparing for war. My understanding is that Pyongyang is pretty quiet. Most of the soldiers on the streets are in fact engaged in construction work. And there isn't a sort of sense of imminent danger in Pyongyang. I saw on the BBC this morning a journalist had been to Panmunjom and complained that there was no sense of tension there, that the North Koreans didn't even mention the fact that they were in a semi-war state. So it isn't quite as serious, I think, as some commentators are. Everybody is exhorted to be careful and to watch. So that is part of the annual reaction, as it were. You've also got this year the continuing expressions of dissatisfaction about UN sanctions arising from both the nuclear test and the rocket test last year. So to a certain extent, it's the usual response, but a bit more edge this year, perhaps because of these other events. But I still don't see in it the move towards a conflict. They keep saying we are ready for war and we could go to war, but they're not actually doing very much about